Hi, it's me. Welcome back to another Limbus Company new ID overview. This week introduced the rerun of Intervallo 5.5-2, Yield My Flesh to Claim Their Bones Bokgak, and brought with it two brand new triple-aught IDs. Kurokumo Clan Captain Ishmael is a brand new bleed unit introduced in the Season 5 gacha pool. Kurokumo Wakashu Heathcliff, on the other hand, can be purchased from the event shop for 1,000 bloodied scabbards, this event's currency. I highly recommend getting Heathcliff if you can for this event, since he's pretty solid even on his own, and I would probably use Ego Shards to get Ishmael once the ability becomes available, starting on February 13th, since pulling on a banner for only one ID is a bit of a waste of lunacy if you can afford to use your Ego Shards. One thing I want to quickly bring up before we get into the IDs proper is that I was originally intending to review every Blade Lineage and Kurokumo Clan ID together in one video, since I assumed they'd all be from the same mirror world. However, these two IDs are actually from a separate mirror world from the rest of the Kurokumo Clan, so I decided to review them as normal instead. With that said, let's jump into the new kits right away. Kurokumo Clan Captain Ishmael is first, and she comes bearing several additional status effects to talk about. The first one that's worth mentioning involves a passive that both she and Heathcliff share in Battle Ready, which permanently gives one slash power up once a Kurokumo Clan ally is defeated, and permanently gives a status of the same name once 3 have been defeated. The Battle Ready effect itself increases the amount of bleed potency and count inflicted by 1 whenever the unit inflicts bleed, plus gives 1 slash power up and 3 slash damage up every turn. That said, intentionally losing 3 Kurokumo allies specifically isn't something that's easy to do, and may not even be something you would want. Speaking of increasing bleed infliction, this Ishmael's support passive is now the 3rd support passive to increase bleed infliction by the fastest ally, granted it's triggered with 3 Lust Resonance instead of 5 Lust owned this time. Moving on to her actual passive, for 3 Lust Resonance, Ishmael will gain 1 Dark Cloud Blade at combat start, if she has another Kurokumo ally in the party. Dark Cloud Blade is a status that increases slash power by 1, and also makes it so that she inflicts 1 bleed potency on hit with any slash skill. It goes without saying that this is going to make bringing at least 1 other Kurokumo ally a must if you want her in your bleed team, because more potency is just more damage, and you need at least 1 other Kurokumo member to gain this effect. This will also apply 1 Dark Cloud to 2 Kurokumo allies adjacent to her on the dashboard. All of the Kurokumo Clan IDs have very middling speed, so there's a good chance that they will be next to her when you activate this effect. Additionally, with 4 Lust Resonance, it will apply to all other Kurokumo allies instead of just the ones adjacent to her. Dark Cloud does 2 things. First, it turns all coins of base attack skills, so not including Ego, into unbreakable coins, and the skill will give 3 more final power on losing a clash, which is actually pretty nice for this archetype. But more importantly, it makes them inflict 1 more bleed with their effects that inflict bleed, and that applies to both potency and count individually. It actually is enough to make bringing 6 Kurokumo IDs a viable team, especially against single target boss fights. Now onto her skills. Scattering Slash is a 4-14 rolling lust evade. Just gonna let that one linger for a second. That grants Ishmael a maximum of 1 protection at combat start. In addition, it also gives 2 defense power up to a minimum of 2 other Kurokumo allies who have the fastest speed. This effect increases with resonance, meaning you can theoretically hit all allies at once, especially since you'll want 3 Lust Resonance pretty much every turn if you bring her in the party anyways. That said, it really only needs to apply to Heathcliff for reasons we'll get to later, at least for now. All that being said, it is just a very solid evade skill once the power-up can apply to herself. Clean Up is a 3-11 rolling slash envy skill with 2 coins that can become a 3-15 if the target has enough bleed. Once Dark Cloud Blade is taken into account, this skill will inflict 5 bleed potency, which is quite a lot for a skill 1. In addition, a very easy 30% damage boost that always applies at least 10% more damage to the second coin means this skill hits surprisingly hard for a skill 1 as well. This skill can also usually roll deceptively high due to the amount of slash power up this ID can gain. Overall, a very solid skill 1 for an ID. Sharpened Blade is a 4-16 rolling slash pride skill with 2 coins that can become a 4-20 if the target has enough bleed. This skill is unquestionably the backbone of damage for the Kurokumo clan, with it both having a 50% damage conditional on itself, but also applying 2 damage up to 2 other Kurokumo allies at the start of combat. You'll want to be using it a lot anyways. The second coin inflicts 2 bleed count on top of giving Ishmael 1 slash power up next turn, and the first coin even inflicts 1 slash fragility on heads hit. If this were all, it would still be a very powerful skill, but there is more to it. If your entire team of 6 units is made up of the Kurokumo clan, instead of giving 2 damage up to her fastest 2 Kurokumo allies, she instead gives 4 damage up to all other Kurokumo allies. It doesn't need to be said that increasing almost your entire team's damage by 40% is crazy good, but she also will, instead of inflicting 1 slash fragility on heads hit with the first coin, inflict 2 fragile. If Ishmael manages to move first in a turn, you could potentially deal an absurd amount of extra damage to any target, especially if that target doesn't already have 4 or more bleed count, thanks to Honglu's Cloud Cutter. It's yet another reason that a full team of Kurokumo clan IDs is a pretty viable team with this update. Ink Over is a 5-17 rolling / lust skill with 3 coins that can become up to a 5-23 if the target has enough bleed. This skill is Ishmael's main way to deal high amounts of damage, which is ironic because the damage conditional is only on the final coin this time, and it inflicts a really high amount of bleed overall. That said, the final coin also forcefully activates enemy bleed 3 times, meaning this skill is going to eat a lot of enemy bleed count, especially if it clashes. Instead, it's best to try to use this skill as a finisher. It always grants 2 slash power up next turn if it manages to kill an enemy, allowing her to clash much better with her other skills as a follow-up. But if your bleed count is already very high, it's a really good move to use in most scenarios. While this ID doesn't perfectly fuel any of her ego, she has several ego that function well with this ID. Firstly, Blind Obsession and Wingbeat both provide healing in one way or another. Wingbeat helps to give Ishmael a tool to absolutely obliterate a single target with some luck, a passive damage bonus, and is her only ego that inflicts bleed. Blind Obsession heals SP and also grants an ally some haste and offense level up every turn, which is pretty nice for support as well. Another ego that I normally don't recommend is Roseate Desire. This is really easy to feel in any bleed team, and since the new Kurokumos care about how many unique status effects are on the target, both Pink Ribbons and Bind count towards increasing your damage. Plus, the added speed control is really nice considering the lower than average speed of the Kurokumo clan. Plus, since you want to be using a Lust Resonance every single turn, having access to at least 1 Lust Ego on each of your IDs is going to be pretty important. Moving on now to Kurokumo clan Wakashu Heathcliff, we have only one more new effect to talk about, and that's Cumulus Wall. This is effectively the same as 1 defense power-up, except it will also expire after using Heathcliff's defense skill. It does this for balance reasons, and we'll talk about it more once we get there. Heathcliff's passive has a lot to it, and it would be easier to explain some of the additional parts of it as we get to some of his skills. The important parts: it activates with 3 Lust Resonance, gives 1 Dark Cloud Blade if at least 1 other Kurokumo clan ally is present, and allows him to deal 10% more damage if his target was either initially at full HP or if they have used defense skills during this turn. That damage conditional also applies to the fastest ally in his support passive, which ironically gives him the least important support out of all of the Kurokumo clan. Lenticular Rend is a 3-11 rolling / wrath skill with 2 coins that can become a 3-15 if the target has enough bleed. This skill is almost identical to Ishmael's skill 1, with the only differences being that it inflicts 1 less bleed, and instead of having a damage conditional, it gives Heath 2 defense power up next turn. Now you might wonder why I'm saving the defense skill for later, but this is part of the reason. All of Heathcliff's skills will enhance this defense skill, which is a pretty major part of his playstyle. But the skill actually does more than it says it does because it's tied to his passive. If you have 3 Lust Resonance and an ally other than Heathcliff gets hit, then he will use his skill 1 against the attacker as an unopposed attack once per turn. This applies all the effects of the skill again, including generating another Wrath resource, which is always pretty good. It also potentially makes losing a clash with a skill that has unbreakable coins, like a full Kurokumo team would want to do, potentially deal more damage than actually winning with it. Storm Cloud is a 4-16 rolling / pride skill with 2 coins that can become a 4-20 if the target has enough bleed. This skill is also very similar to Ishmael's with a more defensive focus. It still inflicts slash fragility with its first coin on heads hit, but instead of giving Heath some slash power up, the second coin inflicts 1 attack power down, though unfortunately for the same turn. That said, it is a good skill for inflicting bleed count, which is always noteworthy. Thunder Cleave is a 5 to 17 rolling / lust skill with 3 coins that can become a 5 to 23 if the target has enough bleed. This skill is Heathcliff's only source of Cumulus Wall, plus it gives him Dark Cloud Blade without needing to activate Lust Resonance for the next turn if it wins a clash. It is also one of the best inflictors of bleed potency in the game, inflicting 11 if Heath uses it while he has Dark Cloud Blade, and another 2 if he has Dark Cloud from Ishmael. The skill itself also deals an absurd amount of damage, with each hit increasing the damage of the final coin by 10%, the second hit inflicting slash fragility, and a damage conditional on the final coin that is always at least 20% active due to the previous coins inflicting debuffs. The surprising part is that this isn't even his primary method of dealing massive damage, that instead goes to his counter. Rules of the Backstreets is a 4 to 9 rolling / lust clashable counter with a single coin. Additionally, if Kurokumo clan captain Ishmael is in battle, the coins, yes plural, of the counter become unbreakable and gain 4 final power after losing a clash. The gimmick here is that the coin can re-roll once for every instance of either Dark Cloud Blade or Battle Ready that Heathcliff currently has, making it deal exceptionally high damage in most scenarios since it does have a 100% damage conditional on the skill itself. While getting Dark Cloud Blade is rather easy through his passive, making this skill still pretty good thanks to it being boosted by the defense power-up on all of his attack skills, getting Battle Ready is a much more difficult endeavor. Thankfully, you can get around this by just having Cumulus Wall, which forces the skill to re-roll the maximum amount of times regardless, hence why the effect dissipates after Rules of the Backstreets is used. And that isn't even all of it. Once again tied to his passive, if the ally who got attacked was killed or has 25% or less of their max HP after being attacked, Heathcliff will instead use Rules of the Backstreets against them as an unopposed attack. It counts as an attack skill when used this way, so it doesn't get the boost from defense power-up, but it can still trigger its re-rolls through Cumulus Wall, Dark Cloud Blade, and Battle Ready. And while this can only happen once per ally, it can actually happen twice per turn, unlike with his skill 1. It's pretty easy to see why this skill is his main source of damage, and I've often found that it's better to just use his counter over his skill 1 on most turns, provided I can actually get to that 3 Lust Resonance. This is actually the first Heathcliff ID without envy, meaning he doesn't perfectly feel any of his ego, but once again, there's a couple worth mentioning. Firstly, Fell Bullet happens to inflict bleed, and while Pride Resonance is not Lust Resonance, it's also usually pretty easy to activate in most bleed setups. Yasunyata Tedrapam is a Lust Ego that provides group SP healing and has 5 attack weight when used at 15 or more SP, and mass inflicts attack power down for the next turn. It also increases Heathcliff's survivability through its passive, which is always a welcome effect. Lastly, Holiday, yet another ego that I do not normally recommend, allows Heathcliff to inflict more bleed as long as he's been afflicted with a negative effect, which can happen pretty consistently. Combine that with the fact that it has a higher roll than Body Sack and more attack weight, means it finally has a decent use case. So, now that we have 6 total Kurokumo clan identities, let's discuss them as a full team briefly. The backbone of this team is definitely our 2 new identities, with Ishmael providing massive amounts of additional damage for her allies. More importantly, getting to 4 Lust Resonance means that every coin that the others use will be unbreakable, which is important because Rodian, Honglu, and Gregor tend to struggle to win clashes. On the plus side though, this means that activating Heathcliff's one-sided attacks is pretty consistent. And speaking about Lust Resonance, let's get it out of the way now. Honglu and Rodian don't have Lust defense skills. This means that if they don't have their admittedly common Lust skill ready, you're going to need to use other allies' defense skills to make up for it. Heathcliff has no problem doing this, but the others lose out on attack if they have to. The team doesn't really struggle to inflict bleed at all, and access to Sanguine Desire means that they can maintain it on a single target pretty handily. When it comes to bleed count, your best inflictor is Ryoshu, with Gregor being the most consistent after her, since he's the only one who inflicts bleed count with his skill 1. Both of these two inflict a lot of debuffs that reduce the offensive presence of the enemy, with Ryoshu mostly inflicting paralyze and damage down, and Gregor inflicting offense level down and plus coin drop. All of this helps, but Gregor's happens to be conditional on the target having 7 bleed on them. Honglu can inflict a ton of bleed potency using Cloud Cutter and does really good damage the same way, even if he loses a clash now thanks to Dark Cloud. His skill 3 is also surprisingly potent as a defensive tool and inflicts a good amount of bleed potency. However, his weird conditional that relies on the target having less than 4 bleed count to reroll the coins of Cloud Cutter really does make it happen less often thanks to the rest of the team being pretty good at inflicting count. In addition, using Roseate Desire once allows you to consistently inflict 1 Lust Fragility each turn, which helps the damage of a bleed team quite a bit. And lastly, unfortunately the least consistent member of the team by far is Rodion, who for some reason is a Poise ID. She can inflict a pretty high amount of bleed potency, 7 with her skill 2, which is pretty awesome, but her skill 1 doesn't do anything with bleed, and her skill 3 is very underwhelming unless it manages to crit. If you want her to be consistent, you kind of have to rely on the support passives of Blade Lineage Yi Sang and Blade Lineage Don Quixote, so that she doesn't just run out of poise constantly. That said, she brings the best ego for the bleed team in Hexnail and Sanguine Desire, so it isn't like she's going to be dead weight. In terms of other support passives, the most important is that of N-Corp Faust. Since you're getting 3 Lust Resonance anyways, you may as well give an ally 15 SP for it too. Overall, while the team definitely has flaws, it is a really solid way to easily build a team provided you have all the parts for it. That said, you can also incorporate these new IDs into a standard bleed team. Having both of them is best, but if you can't manage to get Ishmael, then bringing Heathcliff alongside Kurokumo Ryoshu as your second Kurokumo ID is your best bet for giving Heathcliff Dark Cloud Blade. They also work very well alongside all of the Bloodfiend IDs, especially Gregor, who has insane tankiness to allow Heathcliff to counterattack without much of a downside. Rodion is a staple of bleed thanks to her access to great ego and fantastic support capabilities, and Don Quixote is always a crazy damage dealer. Barber Otis is also a great damage dealer and provides the team with Gluttony, which fuels stuff like Heath's Holiday and Ishmael's Wingbeat. Both of the ring IDs are great as always, since these new Kurokumos inflict things like Slash Fragility and Offense level down in order to make their re-rolling skills more consistent. Hook Honglu is a fantastic consistency tool who you can rely on being too fast to eat a slot from Ishmael's applying of Dark Cloud to Heathcliff. He inflicts a lot of bleed count and provides access to the aforementioned Roseate Desire. Rhino Merceau is still the best inflictor of bleed count in the game, and his bulk also allows Heathcliff to counterattack a lot, plus he gains aggro passively to assist with that process. And lastly, bringing N-Corp Faust in the active team is always good thanks to her ability to accelerate your SP gain. She's also good at inflicting bleed count, though these new IDs are primarily Slash, so they can't benefit from Faust's other supportive effects. And that's about all I have to say about the new Kurokumo clan IDs. While I'm a bit disappointed that we don't have our first complete mirror world, they both provide some very interesting new strategies and are both solid additions, especially with Heathcliff being free for anyone playing for the next month. If you want to try out the new IDs at full power, I have them in my company alongside the old Kurokumo Triple-Lot IDs for anyone who doesn't want to shell out the ego shards to get them. I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed, and tell me your thoughts on these IDs and playstyles in the comments. Thank you for watching, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all again soon.